Folks, C.S. Lewis pictured Satan as the bent one. I believe a bent or twisted view of God is the greatest threat to America today. Politicians like Texas Senate candidate James Talarico are unsuspecting pawns in the hands of the bent one. Now, a bent view of God is far more dangerous than a broken view of God because it's based on half-truths. And half-truths are easy to pass off as truth. James Talarico seems to reinvent God and Jesus in his own image. He's using his political pulpit to confuse many Texans and Americans about who God really is and why it matters. He focuses exclusively on God's love while deep-sixing the rest of God's nature. He reduces God to a one-dimensional being. He even unwittingly implies that God is dumb. Now, how many people do you think might be misled by his bent view of God? Folks, even one is too many. James Talarico has self-identified as a Christian seminarian. A few months ago on Joe Rogan's show, he revealed what that means for him. I mean, things like God is non-binary, God's okay with homosexual behavior and abortion, and that God even asked Mary's permission to impregnate her. Today, I'm going to look at three of James's claims. I'm going to show how each assertion is the result of a bent view of God. In fact, I'm going to show that James thinks that he, not God, gets to determine who God is. Now, in the end, you'll have to decide for yourself if you think James is a follower of God or a reinventor of God. This is Brad Bright. Welcome to the God is the Issue podcast, where I show how God is the issue in every issue. Why? Because we can trace all our human problems to our view of God. If you find this podcast helpful, please remember to like and subscribe. And when subscribing, don't forget to click on the bell so you'll be notified whenever I post a new podcast. James Talarico is a likable guy. He seems to be sincere, and I assume he has good intentions. The problem is that people with good intentions can still wreak untold harm if they have a bent or broken view of God. Think of the Ayatollah, the Inquisition, Karl Marx, the Crusades, and Hitler. What all those folks had in common is a bent or broken view of God. Now, anyone can claim to be a Christian. David Duke, the former Grand Wizard of the KKK, claimed to be a Christian when he ran for governor of Louisiana. I roomed with a guy in boarding school whose dad claimed to be a Christian when he ran for president. After hearing some of his stories, I realized it was just another political conversion. I knew a conservative Republican congressman who was regarded as a great evangelical back in his home district. He was tall, attractive, articulate, and he knew all the Christian lingo. In Washington, we recognized him for what he was, a gifted, silver-tongued liar. Folks, politicians who claim to be Christians are a dime a dozen. I can claim to be a poached egg, but that doesn't mean I am really a poached egg. It may be I'm deluded, or I don't really know what a poached egg is. A Christian is someone who sees God the way the Bible portrays God. After all, the primary purpose of the Bible is not to teach us how to live, but to teach us who God is. Now, it's critical for followers of Jesus to test political candidates' faith claims in order to make wise decisions before we vote. Now, because James is flashing his Christian ID badge and seminary credentials as part of his political campaign, we are obligated to ask whether or not he has a Christian view of God, meaning a biblical understanding of God. Now, for those of you who say, Brad, judge not lest ye be judged, let me be clear. I am not James's judge. Only God is. However, Jesus said we must be fruit inspectors. In Matthew 7:15, Jesus said, beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing. You will know them by their fruits. According to Jesus, we should determine if James is a false prophet or not based on his fruit. We must be fruit inspectors. So, heeding Jesus' warning, let's look at some of James's verbal fruit. Let's start with his claim that God is non-binary. Now, there are two problems with that statement. First, The scriptures overwhelmingly refer to God as male. In the New Testament, the Greek word theos, that is God, appears 1,315 times, almost always in conjunction with a masculine pronoun. God self-identifies as male. In the Bible, God's pronouns are he, him. Is Talarico really refusing to use the pronouns God assigns to himself? That's not very progressive of him. Now, second, in the person of Jesus, God came to earth as a male, as a man. He never requested that people refer to him in any other way. If Jesus was non-binary, don't you think he would have said something? He didn't fear controversy. So, to apply the term non-binary to God rejects both how God self-identifies as well as his incarnational male body. Now, we may not have a choice as to which sex we were born, but God did, and he chose to be born male. So what does that reveal about James's view of God? Well, it seems to indicate that James thinks he has a more accurate view of who God is than God has of himself. God describes himself using male pronouns, but James contradicts God, alleging that he is non-binary. In other words, God's not the sharpest knife in the drawer. James seems to imply that God is rather dumb. Or what about James's statement that God asked Mary's permission to impregnate her? Let's take a look at this clip from the Joe Rogan podcast.
But I say all this in terms of, in context of abortion, because before God comes over Mary and we have the incarnation, God asks for Mary's consent, which is remarkable. I mean, go back and read this in Luke. I mean, the angel comes down and asks Mary if this is something she wants to do. And she says, if it is God's will, let it be done. Let it be. Let it happen. So to me, that is an affirmation in one of our most central stories that creation has to be done with consent.
James frames abortion as not creating. Wow. Cutting the arms and legs off a fetus is now called not creating. The New American Standard Bible, which is probably the most literal Bible translation available in the English language, contradicts James's claims. First, the angel said to Mary, "Behold, you will conceive in your womb and bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus." Does that sound to you like the angel was asking permission? I didn't hear a question there, did you? Apparently, James miraculously does. Folks, he bends Scripture ever so slightly to fit his narrative. But make no mistake, he bends it. Now, before some of you jump to the conclusion that if God didn't get Mary's consent, then God effectively raped Mary, you must first look at the totality of God's nature. God knows everything, past, present, future. He knew from the moment of creation whether or not Mary would want to be the mother of the Son of God. So God didn't need to ask Mary's consent. He already knew she would fully embrace the child with her whole heart. Do you really think God would have entrusted his only son to a woman he knew wouldn't want him? Second, Mary responded to the angel with these words, "Behold, the bondslave of the Lord. May it be done to me according to your word." First, she refers to herself as God's bondslave. Now, many translations say servant, but the most literal translation is bondslave. My dad's tombstone reads, "A slave of Jesus by choice," which is the exact definition of a bondslave, a slave not by force, but by free choice. Even the Apostle Paul described himself as a bondslave. What Mary is saying is, whatever God wants is what I want. Finally, Mary said, "May it be done to me according to your word." She didn't say, "You may do it," as James seems to imply. She said, "May it be done." That's like saying, "I second that motion." That's very different than giving permission. So James's statement, "Before God comes over Mary, God asks for Mary's consent," is not found anywhere in the biblical text. Folks, it's just another case of bent theology. But the critical question is, what does it tell us about James's view of God? James clearly sees God as small as a puny God, a God who requests our permission before he acts, not an all-knowing, all-powerful God who predestined the entire course of the universe, but this timid little God who asks us, is that okay with you? Folks, did God ask Eve's permission before he kicked her out of the garden? Did he ask Joseph's permission before he was sold into slavery? Did he ask Pharaoh's permission to set the Israelites free? Did he ask Job's permission? No, and no. Did he ask my permission before he gave me cancer? When's the last time God asked your permission to do anything? You see, James mocks the sovereignty of God when he implies that God asks our permission. Now, James also believes God endorses homosexual behavior. Watch this video clip of Talarico on the Joe Rogan podcast.
You know, let's take the issue of homosexuality in particular. One is something Jesus never talks about, even though gay people existed in the ancient world. But again, if this was something that really was central to Jesus's ministry, I would think he would have said something about it, right? We have 4 Gospels with tons of teachings from Jesus, and none of them are about this.
Did you know Jesus never condemned slavery either, even though 10 to 20% of the folks in the Roman Empire were slaves? To paraphrase Talarico, we have 4 Gospels with tons of teaching from Jesus, and none of them condemn slavery. Maybe Talarico thinks Jesus was pro-slavery. Do you know what else was common in the Roman Empire? Pedophilia. Jesus never addressed that either. Maybe Talarico thinks Jesus was okay with that as well. What do you think? But here's the question James ducks altogether. If God is okay with homosexual behavior, then why does the Bible always cast it in a negative light? Not a single positive comment anywhere, not even one. If every time I talk about asparagus, I make disparaging remarks like, ew, what are you going to conclude? Does James really believe God is so dumb that God doesn't understand that we take it that way? Does he really believe that God is not all-knowing? Folks, I'd love to hear what you think about Talarico's view of God. Do you believe he believes God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and sovereign? Based on James's fruit, do you think he is a real prophet or a false prophet? Do you think he is a follower of God or a reinventor of God? Now, the bent one knows that he doesn't need to turn everyone into an atheist. He just needs to bend our view of God just a little bit. God didn't send Israel into exile because they denied his existence. He exiled them because they reinvented his very nature. We dare not preach a bent God, and we dare not let false prophets who do go unchallenged. Abortion, homosexuality, and transgender ideology are not the problem. They are simply symptoms of a bent view of God. It's simple cause and effect. God is the issue in every issue, and the better we understand who God is, the easier it is to distinguish between real prophets and false prophets who reinvent God. I hope you found this podcast helpful. If you did, please share it. This is Brad Bright. Thanks for joining me today, and God bless.